In this risky environment in agriculture and especially in ag tech, there are still entrepreneurs out there experimenting and building.
We're always just trying to try things, and I think that's better than not, right? I think people can get flack for trying things, and I just wholeheartedly disagree, right? Like, we need more builders that are putting stuff out there. Some stuff's going to work, some stuff's not going to work.
Tyler and Tim Nuss started a podcast called the Modern Acre 7 years ago, and since then they've become more involved in the family farm and built some adjacent businesses, including most recently AgList.
The ultimate goal of AgList is to be the Yelp for agriculture. We're starting with a very narrow focus in biologicals based on learnings that we saw on our farm over the past 3 or 4 years. We've been adopting and integrating biologicals on our farm, and it's pretty overwhelming as a farmer.
Today we dive into some of those business ventures, and we have some fun brainstorming some potential new ag-related business ideas.
You know, our minds are always racing with business ideas, but the challenge is what to invest in and focus on.
If anyone is based in Northern California and wants to start a porch pumpkin business, we'll be your supplier, so reach out. Let's do it. Business number 5.
Brothers and ag entrepreneurs, Tim and Tyler Nuss, join me to talk about farming, entrepreneurship, and building businesses on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow ag nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hamrich, and every week we get to hear from farmers, founders, innovators, investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. For today's episode, I sit down with Tim and Tyler Nuss. Now, a lot of you might recognize their voices from their podcast, The Modern Acre. After growing up on the family farm in Lodi, California, and then finding out in adulthood that they both were really interested in business and entrepreneurship, they started brainstorming ideas of how they could build something in the ag industry. Tyler said at that time they were big fans of the real estate media brand Bigger Pockets, which had a podcast and then built a community around that podcast and several adjacent businesses as well. So Tim and Tyler set out to do something similar in agriculture, and in their own way, they have. I wanted to bring them onto the show today because in the past year, Tyler announced he would be assuming the role of CEO of Polaris Energy Services, and they both launched what they're calling the Yelp for agriculture, which is called AgList. So Tim and Tyler wear a lot of hats between these businesses, both in agriculture, of course, the podcast, as well as the farm. In fact, Tim's day job is he works full-time on the family farm. Tyler still stays involved from a leadership standpoint. But we'll kick things off here with them going a little bit deeper into their respective backgrounds and what led them to today their assortment of entrepreneurial projects.
Yeah, so obviously Ty and our brothers grew up in a farming family, so that was part of our early upbringing of being out on the farm and working odd jobs on the farm. So always had an affinity for being out on the farm, playing with tractors, being with our dad and our brothers. So that was always a cool experience. I went away to school. When I graduated, there wasn't necessarily a job available for me on the farm. Being a small family farming operation, there's typically not a lot of mouths to feed and not as many jobs on the farm. So I spent the first 10 years of my career in the produce industry, focused primarily on international exports. I worked for marketing companies and exported things like table grapes and citrus and apples, primarily into the Asia region. So I was in ag, like working with vertically integrated grower, packer, shippers, not necessarily on the farm, but working more in the kind of the produce logistics space. And then really got interested as Tyler and I started the podcast back in 2018 about kind of ag tech and venture funded ag tech companies, and spent several years in startups, worked for a couple of venture backed startups, and then made my way back to the farm in late 2022. We had been more interested and involved in what was happening back on the family farm. And there was finally an opportunity for me to take the plunge full circle back to the family farm. So I joined, end of 2022 to manage kind of the sales and business side of the operation, helping with the financials, budget, paying bills, all the kind of office administrative stuff that our oldest brother and dad don't like doing. So I was coming in with a really complementary skill set, like coming from kind of the business world and kind of being comfortable managing that stuff and taking that off their plate, and they can focus on running the day-to-day of the farming operation.
Yeah. And Tyler?
Similar to what Tim mentioned, grew up in this space. If there was a job available for me on the farm, I wouldn't have taken it. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be a farmer. That was I was ready to roll. And just seeing the challenges of farming on the ground, being in a farming family in a tough farm economy at the time. Our primary crop when I was a kid was asparagus. It was a huge crop in the Lodi Stockton area. So we had double, tripled down on this crop, invested in infrastructure, capital equipment, that my dad was kind of building this business. And with NAFTA happening, largely attributed to NAFTA, the production of asparagus was really wiped out over the period of several years. And so that majorly impacted our farm. And so I'm like, I'm a kid going through all this. My dad is doing his best to recover and be flexible and pivot. And so I wanted nothing to do with it. I was like, I want as a safe corporate job as possible. And the big thing at the time was tech. So I studied engineering and fled to Silicon Valley. So that was, my start to my career getting into tech. And then I think over time, Tim and I were really entrepreneurial, right? We were always talking about business ideas, entrepreneurship. We had kind of formed a relationship post-college. We weren't that tight as kids, but we bonded over business and entrepreneurship. And it wasn't even, when we first started talking about it, it wasn't specific to agriculture. It was just like, hey, we want to make money. We want to hustle. We just wanted to build something together. Like we were into real estate for a time, right? And it was kind of around that same time where, we started having more conversations with our dad and our oldest brother about the farm and really thinking about, hey, what do we want to do? Where do we have a competitive advantage? And so, I think we started thinking through, well, we do have a competitive advantage of knowing ag and being part of a farming family. And so maybe there's something there. And that was really kind of the impetus of let's start a podcast. The original thesis was, hey, let's just do bigger pockets, but for agriculture, right? There's all these similarities of, hey, could we develop this community of ag professionals that, have their specific geographies, but can learn from one another? And Bigger Pockets started with a podcast. So we said, let's do a podcast to start with. We ended up not going the Bigger Pockets direction, but that's how things kind of materialized with the podcast.
Oh, very cool. Yeah. And you kind of took this angle of focusing on builders in the industry. And it sounds like that's how you two kind of connected after college is, a shared interest in building things. Tim, I will say it did not surprise me at all when I heard whenever it was that you were going back to the farm and working there. That makes just a ton of sense. Tyler, tell us about Polaris Energy Services. That one, I had never heard of Polaris. You went over there, you were at Rivian, you went over there to be CEO. What is Polaris, and kind of tell me about that opportunity, what attracted you, other than obviously getting back into the industry full time?
Totally. Well, Polaris is a niche business. It's not something that I, can explain to my 6-year-old daughter quickly. I tell her that we help farmers, make more money, right? How do I keep it as simple as possible? But Polaris is one of the leaders in ag energy flexibility solutions. That's a lot of words. Basically, we help growers participate in utility incentive programs like demand response. So demand response is a tool that utilities use and leverage to manage grid reliability. Okay, I'll try to make it even simpler. During the summer months in California, the grid is really stressed, right? Because everyone's running their AC. And utilities have to figure out ways to manage blackouts because blackouts, big problem, right? So demand response is this tried and true mechanism by which utilities will incentivize customers that use a lot of energy to shed their load during demand response events. So essentially the utility, I sign up, say, hey, I'm interested in demand response. The utility will once a month during the peak season call the customers, I'm simplifying it, but call the customer and say, hey, we're having an event tomorrow, shut off your power. And then I'm compensated accordingly to basically how much load I shed. So these programs exist in a ton of different markets, a ton of different industries. Commercial industrial is a big one, but agriculture is a really big one, specifically around pumping load. Pumping load is a great energy asset from flexibility perspective because the pump's either on or off, right? Whereas in facilities, you have a gazillion things on. You have to figure out, hey, we're turning off half of those things, right? Whereas pump, you just turn it on or off. And so it's actually a very good resource for utilities to have this grid reliability. So what Polaris does is we help growers do that. And so we help growers enroll in these programs. We manage the whole process to them, and we enable it through our own hardware by automating pumps, but also work with third-party partners, automation partners, so that customers can participate in these programs and earn revenue by participating.
And so then do you get a cut from the utility company?
Yes. So we are a DR, a demand response aggregator. So there's a number of them. None of them are focused specifically on agriculture. That was really the thesis of the owners, the founders of, hey, there's a great opportunity in market specifically in agriculture. Any of the big players, like they're massive, massive players that are DR aggregators across multiple markets, they're industry agnostic, right? And they kind of dilute the ag nuance, right? And there's a ton of nuance in ag. When you talk to a grower about irrigation, it's like the most important thing, right? It's how do we make sure we irrigate our crops at the right time, the right amount, with as low of risk as possible. So if you go to a grower and say, hey, can you shut off some pumps? They're like, heck no, right? And so we have the nuance to understand farming and doing what is actually operationally doable for you, right? So that's kind of our special sauce is we work with growers. Hey, you actually can participate. This is how we use automation and we have flexibility in these different capacities. And you can earn 50 grand this year by doing this. And it's actually very doable and we know how to do it and we can work with you on it, right? So we come from an ag, focus perspective that I think differentiates us from like the big, industry agnostic aggregators.
It makes sense. And as you kind of alluded to earlier, irrigation is such a nuanced thing and obviously important thing, especially in a place like California. How do you make sure that, you're optimizing for irrigation, but still collecting the benefit from demand response? How does that play out?
Totally. And that, I think there's a lot to be said there. I think that energy should be one component of how a grower thinks about irrigation, like scheduling or management, right? Agronomy is another, just operational timing, right? Our brother, it's all in his head, right? So he's manually, managing, we're doing over 10 crops on our farm at any given year, and he's got it all kind of in his head. And then there's, the other end of the spectrum where there's growers that are really, really sophisticated, really down the journey in their irrigation automation. Everything's automated, right? They have soil sensors and they're taking agronomic feedback to determine, hey, we need 8 hours of pump water on this field or on this set, right? It's very sophisticated. Not to say my brother's is not, but energy should be kind of one component of this, right? So we just launched a new program similar to demand response, but it's a grid reliability solution, but it's a different mechanism. And that's called hourly flex pricing. It's dynamic pricing. So this is a new pilot that we're doing with PG&E in California where growers can actually respond and see prices on an hourly basis. And that further, plays into this whole scheduling thing, right? If you know from an agronomic and operational perspective that you need 6 hours of water, right? Now, if you know you need 6 hours, what are the lowest energy cost 6 hours, right? And so I think that's where we're moving towards as an industry, that I think holy grail, right? Can we get all these inputs in and have it all automated so that your irrigation is 100% optimized, if that makes sense?
Very cool. And I'm going to hazard a guess here, and you can redirect me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing the other business that you launched in the last year was already in the works when this Polaris thing kind of came about. Because you went to go be the CEO of Polaris, and then, I don't know, 6 months later or so, launched AgList. Is that right?
You have it right. We've kind of made a career out of doing a lot, and I think experimenting, right? Like with the podcast, we've experimented with a ton of different stuff, and we're always just trying to try things. And I think that's better than not, right? I think people can get flack for trying things, and I just wholeheartedly disagree, right? Like we need more builders that are putting stuff out there. Some stuff's going to work, some stuff's not going to work. The goal of the podcast was always like this thesis of build the audience first and the business later, right? Is like this philosophy of content marketing, right? And you know this well. And so we thought, hey, let's build a following, let's build the network. And ultimately the goal is to build businesses on top of that platform. And so last year, Tim and I were just talking about like, hey, ag is kind of like not really fun right now, right? Like in ag tech VC, like their companies are really struggling. And we both were just talking about like ag needs to have a little bit more fun. And so we thought, what would be like a fun business idea that also solves a real need and challenge in the industry that we could spin up, right? Because of the prominence of low or no code tools. There's a lot of opportunity to just build something with a reasonable amount of resources and launch it to the market and see what happens. So that was something with AgList we can get into, but we had the idea of building it probably about a year ago. So it had been slowly kind of setting the groundwork. So doing multiple things. Polaris is the full-time day job, but we wouldn't be us if we weren't always having a side hustle.
Good for you. No, I think it's great. And I personally, I don't love the media business model at all. So you all using your content to, leverage into other business models, I think is really, really smart. I think it's necessary for those of us who want to keep creating content to have the revenue come from somewhere else. But that's related and mutually beneficial. But Tim, maybe introduce us to AgList. Tyler just kind of teased it a little bit there. What exactly is AgList?
The ultimate goal of AgList is to be the Yelp for agriculture. We're starting with a very narrow focus in biologicals based on learnings that we saw on our farm over the past 3 or 4 years. We've been adopting and integrating biologicals on our farm, and it's pretty overwhelming as a farmer. There's hundreds of these companies that are all doing direct outreach to farmers that have their unique solution on how they're going to solve whatever problem it is. And it's a lot to sift through as a farmer of case studies and white papers and a lot of the stuff that I'm not an agronomist, so a lot of it goes over my head. And so me as a farmer, when I get reached out to by a new company, the first thing I do is call other growers that I'm friendly with and say, hey, have you heard about this company or this product? What do you have to say about it? And get kind of that feedback. And that's kind of what gives me the confidence either to move forward and try something or just keep it on the shelf. And so the idea was to basically digitize this experience where there's a lot of momentum right now in biologicals of how do we transition away from synthetics? And there's a lot of conferences happening around this. The Mixing Bowl puts out these landscape maps, and there's the biologicals landscape map that's this really cool one-pager. There's 500 logos on it, and
you need a microscope to see them all.
Yeah, I'm sure took a ton of time to put together. It's cool to look at, but not particularly helpful for either side of the picture. As a grower, it's I don't know what to do with this. I can't call these 500 companies, and then if you're one of the biological companies, you're one logo in a sea of hundreds. It's really hard to differentiate. You could have a great product with a lot of good customers, but you're next to a startup that is doing R&D trials. So it's not particularly helpful for either side. So the idea was how do we digitize this and make something that's useful for growers and kind of get all these companies on an independent platform, create the ability for growers to endorse products and solve 2 key challenges. One is discoverability of just growers don't know these products exist. And 2, building trust and social proof in the industry where, you hear bug in a jug and snake oil, biologicals have been around for decades and they typically have a negative connotation about them. So how do we really create transparency and trust in the space and lean into kind of the endorsements of other growers are using this, things have changed, and kind of build that out. So those are the 2 areas that we're focused on.
And it seems like the response from the companies has been, really positive. I've seen a few posts where you announce kind of a new either partner or new product on there. It seems like it's going really well.
Totally. I think the feedback has been really positive. And I think most companies that were all in from the start just believed in the rising tide lifts all ships mentality, right? Of we need to build transparency in biologicals. We need to be able to have growers understand their options, see what is working for other growers. And so it's been very encouraging just to see, companies be excited about what we're building. And we had a number of, one of our strategies for launching was we don't want to just build this in the dark and then launch it. We want to kind of collaborate with some early partners. So we got a number of launch partners signed up before we had a product built. To their credit, we kind of gave them the vision. This is what we want to do, but we'd love your involvement and your feedback so we can actually build something that's useful and valuable to you, valuable to the industry. And I think that helped us kind of kickstart the momentum when we launched 2 months ago.
And the companies are paying to be on there, right? That's how it works?
Yeah, we structured the business model where companies pay to list their products. The benefit for biological companies, it's getting them more exposure, right? It's new potential leads for their products. And, it's high targeted search, right? When a grower comes and is searching by biostimulant in this geography for this crop, that's a high intent customer. And it's showing that filtered search result for growers. And so it's high intent customer enablement. And then it's again, this idea of building farmer trust. And what we've seen a lot of companies get excited about is using AgList as kind of a third party marketing collateral, right? It's one thing to be go to tylersbiologicalcompany.com/testimonials, right? And read the testimonials. But it's another thing to say, hey, go check out our listing on AgList, right? And see how we've had 7 growers and agronomists endorse and tell their story of how they're using our products and having a good experience. Like, I think a lot of companies, that's been an aha moment for them of like, yeah, that is a lot of value there.
And how do you validate that the people claiming to be growers and agronomists actually are and actually have the experience with the product and are not just, I don't want to accuse people of this, but there are those that are just trolls out there.
Yeah, one thing we thought of really early on, one strategic decision we made was we were originally thinking a standard 1 to 5 star review system, rating system, right? Just like Yelp or any other kind of review platform. And we quickly pivoted to this endorsement strategy. It's 1 or 0. You endorse the product or you don't. And the goal of that was to eliminate some of the negativity, right? There's some weird ag forums online, right, that are very negative, You
guys been on New Ag Talk?
Yeah. No comment. And so we wanted to make AgList a positive place. Like, the goal of AgList, hey, let's weed out the snake oil, yes, but let's not have it be a place where a grower had a bad experience and they're, leaving a 1-star angry review, because that's not going to really be helpful for anyone. And so we went to this endorsement structure. We still think the best products are going to rise to the top and get the most endorsements, right? But we don't have kind of this weird dynamic of 1-star reviews. And we're moderating and checking every endorsement that comes in. As of today, there has not been like offshore endorsement workers doing fake endorsements, but it's something that we're going to continue to monitor and focus on. How do we make sure that we're verifying these things? And that's one thing we did up front is they're giving their name, they can connect their LinkedIn profile, right? They're giving their location, so we can do some validation and verification that they're real endorsements, but something that we'll continue to make sure we're monitoring as we scale.
But you do show if somebody says, I do not endorse this product, like I have experience with it and I do not endorse it, you don't show that. Only if they do endorse it.
Only kind of like on LinkedIn, right? I'll endorse you for leadership. I'm not going to not. Tim is.
I just want to be clear. I do not endorse Tim.
I do not endorse his leadership. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Makes sense. So I'm putting myself in your shoes in the podcasting game. If I did this, the partners I worked with would all want to be on the podcast. And I noticed on AgList, you even have a little Modern Acre logo where they have been on the podcast. So how do you keep those two things separate? Or do you even try to keep those two things separate?
Yeah, this is still a work in progress. We're building out some functionality for kind of third-party partners that aren't necessarily a biological company. They're not a distributor, retailer, or grower, but basically third parties. There's companies that develop technology for biological companies that their customers are biological companies, almost like the Intel Inside chip, where a Dell PC might have an Intel sticker on it. It's some unique piece of technology that's super driving their products. So we're working with a number of partners to kind of build out kind of credentials and badging on certain products to help them stand out, where this product might have 2 or 3 badges that are some interesting feature of the product. So with the podcast, basically the idea there is we could have kind of links to, if we've had these companies on the podcast, how do we link their episode and kind of highlight that if someone wanted to take a deep dive into Sound Ag or Kula Bio or a number of our partners on the platform, they could kind of find that link and redirect back to the podcast to get that flywheel going.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we want to make AgList a whole ecosystem, right? And supportive of the whole ecosystem, right? We don't want it just to be biological companies shouting at the world. How do we set up roles and profiles for each of the different stakeholders, right? So we have profiles for growers, for agronomists, for researchers. Those 3 are the endorsers, right? So a researcher, and this is a problem in the industry. Researchers often have a tough time getting the word out, right? Independent researchers that want to share what they've worked on. This is now a platform they can go say, hey, we did research on this product and had a good outcome, good result, and we endorse them. And similar with agronomists, right? Especially some of these regenerative, forward-thinking agronomists that are trying to promote biological solutions. This is a way that they can, get out in the industry. And then we built out distributor dealer functionality, right? So, talking about the channel is a lot of these companies go through dealers, right? So there's this tension with biological company wanting to get endorsements for their products, but in many cases, they don't have the direct relationship with the growers, right? So it's often the dealers. And so that was one of the first challenges upon launching. We're like, man, we need to kind of solve for this tension because we want it to be collaborative. And so the idea we had is distributors also have a role on AgList. So they can create a profile and actually have a public facing profile for free, right? So they're not paying, but they can get a public facing profile. And as they go out and talk to their growers that had good experiences, they can get tagged on endorsements, and that will rank them higher on the distributor page, right? So they can be a top distributor on AgList by promoting and getting their growers to endorse products. So we have this challenge in a business like this of getting growers to endorse, right? That's a challenge, that's a problem. And so we've tried to set it up in such a way where every stakeholder in the industry can participate and they have the right incentives to keep people on the platform and keep coming back to the platform.
And can I see, if I see a product and it's got 10 endorsements, can I see how many of those are growers versus agronomists versus distributors or someone else? I could see the breakdown.
Exactly. And distributors can't endorse. So, we want to protect for that, right? If I'm a grower, Tim is my dealer, and I'm buying a Sound Agriculture, we'll use them because they're the number one product on AgList. Shout out to Sound Agriculture. So if I go endorse Sound, I can tag Tim as who I purchased through. So that's the way that he can basically get credited and incentive for getting me to endorse the product. Tim wins because now he's ranked higher. He's ranked as a top distributor for Sound. Sound wins because they get endorsement on their product, right? So setting up these proper incentives is something we've thought a lot about.
That's a neat. I didn't realize that was going on. That's really cool. I like that part a lot. I do think the trusted advisor, for lack of a better term, deserves more of a presence in this whole conversation, and it's cool to see them have an incentive to engage and participate. Well, and you guys are involved, at least 4 businesses that we've talked about, right? I mean, between the podcast, AgList, Modern Acre, and the farm. What are the other ideas you have floating around that you can't execute on, that you can be on the other side of the table and just be the guy that has the idea and let somebody else take it and run with it? Are there any things ag specific that come to mind that you're thinking about right now?
Yeah, so my idea is kind of like an AI app for where your food comes from. Like, have you heard about Cal AI?
No.
It's basically like a food tracker app where instead of like logging in what you're eating, like what the calories are, you can just take a picture of your plate and it'll basically analyze 30 grams of protein, 50 grams of fat, whatever it is, just based on a picture. So the idea is this concept, but for like country of origin and food, where there's a lot of like misleading things around like food packaging and where product comes from. There, I gave the example in the podcast a couple of weeks ago. I bought this bean pasta, lupin bean pasta, really cool packaging, CPG brand, and on their company FAQs it says made in the USA, and said that's interesting. Like maybe we could grow this bean on our farm and be a supplier, and like the wheels get spinning of like this is really cool. And then I did some research on the bean, and all the production primarily comes from offshore. So I'm like, that doesn't really make sense. I reached out to the company and said, see, your products are made in the USA, but where do you source your beans from? And they're like, Australia. And I was like, that's very misleading. Like nowhere in your supply chain does it say that. So it's kind of like basically like a tool where you could take a picture of a CPG and actually like get the real truth of where these inputs are coming from, not just where it's processed, but where the ingredients are coming from. I think a lot of people are interested in that with like their seed oil scout, which is doing something similar for like, are there seed oils in this product? But for people that are really focused on like buying local or buying products from the USA, I think it could be an interesting idea.
I like it. It sounds like I need to check out this Cal AI app. I could benefit from that, but also definitely local food has been on my mind a lot lately. So I resonate with that part of it too. All right, Tyler, you're up.
Well, that's a great segue. It's almost like you do this for a living. My big idea that I just can't get off my mind, but I don't have the time, energy, resources to focus on it, is I just think there needs to be innovation in grocery. I think there's an opportunity for, as simply as I can put it, Whole Foods 2.0, right? Whole Foods started with grand ambitions and I think really from a great place. They got acquired by Amazon, and things change when you get acquired by Amazon. And you go into Whole Foods now, and it was supposed to be the place. You go into Whole Foods, you don't have to look at labels, right? You can trust everything is sourced with this highest degree of integrity. But you go in now and you have to look at every label because there's obviously a lot of processed food, but a lot of not great ingredients and kind of misleading labels and things like that. And so I go into Whole Foods now. I do sometimes shop there, but it's not because I can just like blindly trust their products, right? And so I think there's a huge opportunity here. It's a big problem, a big idea, but probably $1 billion business, right? To do Whole Foods 2.0 and do it again with a focus on local sourcing of, hey, how can we locally source as much as possible in kind of the produce section, right? And then also just foods with clean ingredients, right? And so it can be the place where consumers can trust. And obviously, this is probably like a coastal thing, right? It kind of starts at the coast. It's for that high income earner, but people that are caring about clean ingredients, healthy ingredients. So I've been thinking a lot. I've talked to a few folks about it. I mentioned it on one of our podcasts recently. And I think a lot of people like see this as an opportunity, but it is a big thing to execute on. So I don't really want to do it, but I'd love to help if I could.
I love it. I get the impression you guys are a lot like me in that these ideas kind of come and go through your head multiple times a week. And, just listening to you, a couple of things that came to my mind. Number one, I'm big on legumes in general. So like peas, lentils, chickpeas. I do the Growing Pulse Crops podcast for that group. And just I think that there's a ton of opportunity in fiber. I think, fiber is the new protein in a lot of ways, and it's a lot harder to get fiber in the diet rather than just like protein where you can get a supplement. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in those crops for fiber. And then also, I think for lack of a better analogy, like a Groupon for Farm Direct. You guys did some Farm Direct stuff through a website. I bought some squash from you a couple years ago, I think.
Oh, man. I didn't even know that. That makes me so happy.
Yeah, it was good. It was delicious. So I endorse the squash. But I think I was talking to a guy in California, James Cinciolo, shout out to him, who is doing some Farm Direct stuff with walnuts and cherries. And, with cherries, you kind of got to ship when those cherries are ready to go. They got to go, right? So almost like a Groupon where this week we're featuring James. He's got cherries. Here's a discount, but they got to go now. You ready? You ready? And trying to build something there. I think that would be kind of fun. None of my businesses are like venture backable unicorns. They're just I think they would be fun to do.
Well, I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think this is a thesis Tim and I have talked a lot about is venture-backed startups. Great. That's awesome. We need ag tech investors and investment, but I think everyone's been drunk on venture capital. And I think there's so many good opportunities in ag that just don't need to be VC backed. But everyone it's either one or zero. It feels like you have to do a VC backed business or just don't do it at all. And I think there's so many opportunities that, especially with the rise of low no code tools, AI tools, where you can build stuff really quickly, really cheaply, and fit a great niche market, but you don't have to overtake the world. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities, and that's why Tim and I are like, let's grab this domain. We have an idea. Let's go spin something up, but we have to be somewhat focused. I think 4 is our absolute limit. Do you agree, Tim?
Yeah. Last summer, we fell in love with the idea of porch pumpkins and decorating pumpkins with porches, the seasonal business model we heard a little bit about last year. Locked up porchpumpkin.com, found out there's a porchpumpkinsplural.com that's already crushing it in Dallas. So infringed on their trademark, so we're not going to be able to use that domain. But yeah, there's all these crazy niche businesses where listen to a podcast with this lady that runs it in Dallas and makes over $1 million a year in 1 month, just decorating people's porches with pumpkins. So it's you could grow a field of pumpkins and put something like that together. There's all these kind of small pockets and slivers, and it's not a venture-backed company, but that's a pretty nice little business.
Well, and just to jump in on that idea, I think, Tim, you'll find this interesting. This pumpkin idea, Tim and I were really fascinated with for a while, and it was further the feeling was further exacerbated by the fact that we grew pumpkins on Nuss Farms last year, and the market tanked when we were ready for harvest. And so we had a field, I don't know how many acres, Tim, 40 acres or something, of beautiful, beautiful pumpkins that we grew that were just left in the field because the market was tapped. There was no demand. And I think it was a hot fall. So people were just not in the fall festive mood. And I was like, man, this is such a bummer. This is another opportunity in agriculture of this whole food waste conversation and direct to consumer. It was a travesty. I was out there with my dad and filling up my car with pumpkins to take home to San Diego. And he's like, take as many as you want because these are all going to be rolled over. And I'm like, there's got to be opportunities in areas of opportunity for this. And maybe it's we can put these on people's porches and make some money while we do it. But, our minds are always racing with business ideas, but the challenge is what to invest in and focus on.
If anyone is based in Northern California and wants to start a porch pumpkin business, we'll be your supplier. So reach out. Let's do it. Business number 5.
Hey, you never know. Make it happen. And it's funny what a catalyst an available domain is. Oh man, that's a sign. We got to do this. But I think it's cool. And I know some people are ooh, seasonal businesses, but I'm the opposite. I'm interested in seasonal businesses. If all the money comes in 1 month, I'm totally fine with that as long as the money comes. But it sounds like what you needed with the pumpkins is a Groupon for direct farmer marketing.
Why don't we just do it together, Tim? Let's after this call, let's lock up the domain.
If there's a domain available, it's a done deal. That's the only contingency. Well, I know you guys got to go pretty soon, but while we're on the topic of kind of direct to consumer, I know you all have thought a lot about that. The difference is you all have a farm, so it's an option to you, whereas me, it's more just a hypothetical chatter. Is that still something you're striving towards as far as trying to capture more of the value, or is it something that is just in practice too difficult to really manage?
Yeah, it's been a little bit challenging. We've played around with it, and it's kind of a scale challenge where when we're farming at scale, we're, each field is 50 acres. And when we go to kind of this micro production of doing an individual box and packaging that, it's a different logistics, different labor, different infrastructure to facilitate and execute that. And yes, you're getting a premium, but it's a eighth of an acre versus an entire field. So typically it's not as efficient for us to do that. I don't think it's out of the picture, but from what we've experimented with, it's a little challenging for us to integrate. So we've worked with we've partnered with local companies. There's one called Pick to Porch that does local food distribution in Lodi, which is where our farm is. And they basically work with local growers and do food boxes. So in May, they'll have local cherries from California. We worked with them on watermelons this year where they had, it's 80 households in Lodi that are all getting local produce, and a Nuss Farms watermelon showed up on their porch. And so integrations like that through a partner, I think, are more at our level versus us doing it ourselves.
This is something that I learned over the years of getting involved in the farm, that high level, hey, we just develop the market ourselves, go direct to consumer. There's all that margin there. Awesome. Why not? And then you begin to understand these scale discrepancies, right? When you see truckloads of tomatoes and the scale that we're operating at. And we had some conversations back in the day with a baby food company, right? And hey, let's do some squash and we'll figure out the processing step, tell the story, the transparent supply chain story. Here's the farm the squash was grown at. And we get to the next part of the conversation. All right, what's your volume? What are you doing? And to Tim's point earlier, it's it'd be the equivalent of us doing, a tenth of an acre. And so then you do the math. And I think this is what it comes down to is financial, right? Is what's going to move the needle. And in terms of resources, right? Of how much time, energy, resources it would take to facilitate that on a tenth of an acre and the financial return versus just pivoting one of our crops from a low value crop like corn to a higher value crop like peppers, even though it's a commodity pepper. So I think we've kind of been through that evolution, but we're still such believers in it, but just figuring out there's, I think, business opportunities there is how to facilitate it. Yeah, figuring out the scale dynamic has been a interesting learning.
Cool, guys. Well, thank you both very much for this interview. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
All right, well, that is going to do it for today's episode. Thank you very much to both Tyler and Tim Nuss for being on the show. Hope you all enjoyed that. I know especially those of you who are entrepreneurs and who are builders probably enjoyed that conversation. And if that's you, I'm sure you're probably already listening to their podcast, The Modern Acre. But if not, go check that out for sure. Also, we'll leave links in the show notes for their other ventures, including Nuss Farms, AgList, and Polaris Energy Services. Thanks again to Tim and Tyler for taking time to be on the show here today. And last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.